General and Ministry of Legal Affairs. At this media conference, we will be providing an opportunity for members of the public to hear directly from the Attorney General regarding vaccination in the public sector. I now hand over to the Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs, the Honourable Faris Al-Rawi.
Thank you very much, Nasir. Good afternoon to Trinidad and Tobago, to the very many viewers tuning in this afternoon. It's a busy day before Christmas Eve, and I can tell you, having been in San Fernando at the San Fernando General Hospital today at the pediatrics unit, that the traffic is severe. So I ask you please today to just be careful on the roads. I've come this afternoon to give a direct update on a very large issue, and that is the issue of the government's policy with respect to vaccinations in the public sector. I'm pleased to inform that I met yesterday with two divisions of representation for people. Let me explain that. On the first hand, on the one hand, we had the several representatives of the trade union organization, and on the other hand, we had representatives for persons in the protective services. Yesterday, I held a meeting at 4:30. The chairman opposite me was Mr. Ansel Roger, who came under the umbrella of the Joint Trade Union Movement, apart from the home organization of the OWTU. Mr. Ansel Roger and Mr. Ozzy Warwick together presented themselves. Mr. Ansel Roger did the speaking, and they spoke for and on behalf of other persons who were in attendance. And they were, for the record, Ms. Antonia De Freitas of Tutor. We had Mario Alves and Trevor Johnson from the Banking, Insurance and General Workers Union. We had Mr. Clyde Elder from the Communication Workers Union. We had Cassandra Tommy from the Amalgamated Workers Union. We had Ermine Debik Mead from the Contractor and General Workers Trade Union. We also had in attendance Mr. David Forbes from the Trinidad and Tobago Postal Workers Union. We had Mr. Timothy Bailey from the Steel Workers Union of Trinidad and Tobago. In attendance as well, Robert Benacia from the Industrial, General and Sanitation Workers Union. We had in attendance Letitia Cox from the Trinidad and Tobago Registered Nurses Association. We had Derek Richardson from the Estate Police Association. We had Mr. Nirvan Maraj from the All Trinidad General Workers Trade Union. We also had Mr. Peter Farmer from the Aviation, Communication and Allied Workers Union, and also Mr. Joseph Remy from the Federation of Independent Trade Unions and NGOs, that is FITON. In the second meeting held at 5:30, I'm pleased to inform that representation from the Trinidad and Tobago Police Services and Social Welfare Association, Inspector Gideon Dixon and Mr. Ansel Ford were in attendance. From the Prisons Officers Association, Mr. Seron Richards and Mr. Lester Walcott. And from the Fire Services Association, Mr. Leo Ramkisoon and Marcella Simon. At these meetings, I introduced the objective of the meeting, the objective being to understand the position of the several entities as it relates to the government's announced policy. I, of course, expressed my gratitude that all of these very many representatives saw it fit and, in fact, attended at this meeting at not even short notice, at notice that I will refer to as immediate notice. Certainly, the government expresses its gratitude for these very many people presenting themselves as they did. The agenda included explaining the circumstance of the policy that has been announced. The policy that has been announced is that the government intends to roll out a vaccination requirement for and in respect of persons who are in the public sector, where a person who is in the public sector, be it as a manager, an employer, or an employee, is required, if they are to attend the workplace, to have received a vaccination regime. Secondly, there are exemptions to that policy where persons who have medical deferrals certificates, persons who have medical exemption certificates will be permitted to participate in employment as normal, and persons have the option, if they choose not to be vaccinated, to certainly have regular PCR testing if they are in the bracket of medically exempt or medically deferred personnel. The unions through Mr. Roger expressed a very clear position that they did not support the government's policy. Mr. Roger was very articulate and very clear in saying that the position of the several unions that he spoke for and on behalf of were based upon two conditions precedent. The first condition precedent is that the government must immediately withdraw the announced policy. The second clear condition precedent, repeated on several occasions, is that the government is to provide empirical evidence that the vaccinations that are being deployed, firstly, will stop someone from contracting COVID, and secondly, will stop persons from being infected by way of transmission, failing which the unions indicate that they will not support the government's policy and that it should be a voluntary program. In the second meeting with the protective services, there was general discussion which did not have as few particulars as the first meeting. In the second meeting, the representatives of protective services asked for a number of items which I will enumerate now, and also, generally speaking, indicated that they too did not support the government's approach on this issue. In the meeting that Mr. Roger spoke for and on behalf of the several persons, I asked Mr. Roger very plainly whether he had any indication as to what proposals would be put forward from his team. Mr. Roger indicated that he was not prepared to indicate to the government any of those submissions unless the two conditions precedent were satisfied. I asked Mr. Roger whether the unions were in a position, assuming that I could get the two conditions precedent satisfied, whether they were in a position to at least identify the time frame within which we can treat with the matters. Again, Mr. Roger very plainly said that he was not in a position to indicate the time frame. I asked Mr. Roger specifically whether he would consider giving us this information in view of the circumstances that we stand in, because any discussion has to be had in the context of the virus that we are dealing with. Mr. Roger asked about the product which several representatives had worked on together with the Minister of Labour, and asked what had happened to that product. He indicated that he felt a sense of betrayal from the government because there was a general discussion which found itself in a document which was taken to Cabinet and which was referred to the Finance and General Purposes Committee. I explained to Mr. Roger that that document which was worked upon was an inappropriate point of reference. Number one, because it was developed in respect of a circumstance which is very different. That was when we were dealing with the alpha version of the virus, long before the Delta and Omicron versions. Secondly, that particular document was premised upon the fact that it was a discussion on the industrial relations law and therefore the collective bargaining process. I indicated that the government's position is to treat with the law and not individual collective bargaining processes, because the law stands above the collective bargaining agreement process. So that persons in the public domain understand this, permit me to explain that a collective bargain is an agreement which is recorded and lodged between an employer and an employee, which speaks to terms and conditions. rules of engagement. In the collective bargaining process and in collective bargaining agreements, parties usually go through processes where they may wish to amend or understand better, and these go into discussions. If there is no agreement, you can have an unresolved dispute between a union and an employer. If an unresolved dispute stands, the Minister of Labour issues a certificate. The matter is referred to the industrial court. When you get to the industrial court, there may or may not be mediation at the industrial court, and then there is a process that can be unfolded to allow for some degree of conciliation. If that does not work, parties are invited to file evidence and arguments in a trade dispute. Evidence and arguments are put before the court, and then the court makes a decision. From that industrial court setting, there is the possibility of appeal, and therefore that entire collective bargaining process, which is different from collective agreement to collective agreement, that circumstance stands as inappropriate when we are dealing with the virus that is now an Omicron variant of the COVID-19 virus, where the infection rate is that the virus doubles itself every 2.5 days. It is important, ladies and gentlemen, that we bear in mind that the second condition precedent put forward by Mr. Roger, that the government produce empirical evidence that the vaccines will cause a recipient to not contract the virus or not be capable of spreading the virus, is simply an impossibility. I explained to Mr. Roger that the government could not satisfy that second condition because nowhere in the world has that condition been satisfied. I put on the table that the government was treating with the position where the data that has been given to Trinidad and Tobago at weekly press conferences, at bi-weekly press conferences, at daily press conferences, that data demonstrated that 9 out of 10 persons in high dependency or in intensive care, 90% of the persons occupying those facilities and who are at risk of death are unvaccinated. In those circumstances, the data which we have in Trinidad and Tobago demonstrates that unvaccinated people are at risk of dying, whereas vaccinated people stand in 1 out of 10. Mr. Roger very plainly and very frankly informed me that the unions, as he spoke for them, do not trust the government, do not trust the Prime Minister, and do not trust the data. I asked Mr. Roger whether he had doubt about the public servants who have commendably provided that data and laid it out for the population on a daily basis. The Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Roshan Parasram, the expert in epidemiology, Dr. Avery Hines, Cambridge graduate, Dr. Miriam Richards, Dr. Trotman, and the very many members of the team from the Ministry of Health. Mr. Roger took time to explain that he did not trust the data and he did not trust the politicians. I was a little taken aback at that expression. Mr. Roger indicated that the data that they had, that he would rely upon, if I got him correctly, would come from the TTRNA, the Trinidad and Tobago Registered Nurses Association, and he seemed to suggest that that data was different from the government's data. I say today to Trinidad and Tobago that I have requested the Minister of Health to allow access into the data that has been presented, and I publicly call upon Mr. Roger to produce the data that he has that is in conflict with that which the CMO and the team of experts has provided. I have also asked my colleague, the Minister of Health, to put onto the Ministry of Health's website access to all of the global literature, very importantly from the World Health Organization and from other countries, so that the data which the world is treating with in relation to this virus is also accessible, because our local data is exactly in keeping with what the international data looks like. So if Mr. Roger does not trust the government's data, he can easily understand it in the context of data that exists elsewhere. Mr. Roger was very careful to indicate that the unions were not anti-vaccine. Mr. Roger took his time to share his own experience that he had taken a vaccine. The question that lies right now for all of Trinidad and Tobago is, if Mr. Roger is not against vaccinations and has gone to the fact of having taken a vaccination, I would simply ask this question: on what basis does Mr. Roger explain to the country the fact of taking a vaccine? You see, if you take a vaccine, you have to have a certain belief in the vaccine. And if the belief in the vaccine is that it will assist you in not being one of the 9 people in ICU who are at risk of death because you're unvaccinated, I just simply need to understand, as the drafter of laws, what the policy Mr. Roger is explaining to the country is. Because you respectfully have me in a position where I simply do not understand how you can decide to take a vaccine but not be in support of others taking a vaccine. So perhaps Mr. Roger can explain that position for us. Ladies and gentlemen, in treating with the protective services, I received some very useful submissions. The protective services had a number of matters which they considered important for the government's consideration. They include, and we share concern on the first issue, the issue of liability. Secondly, the protective services wish to have medical insurance. Thirdly, the protective services wish to have priority for treatment and testing. They have recommended that the protective services have first priority on testing, on admissions, and, as I understood it, on bed care treatment. I also understand that the protective services wished to have a deeper education exercise. They recommended that every person in the protective services have access to a doctor provided by the state and nursing personnel provided by the state, where their medical status can be determined on a one-on-one basis, and then they can be taken into the priority treatment. We also received the recommendation that there should be an incentive to take the vaccine. These are the submissions that we received in general from the protective services. I explained to the protective services that whilst priority treatment is a recommendation of theirs, the difficulty in giving priority access to law enforcement, whether it is in the prison service, police service, or fire services, that would have to be treated equally with nurses, with doctors, with frontline healthcare workers, with immigration officers, and that if you were to really contemplate the number of people who are on the front line, we would be dealing with hundreds of thousands of persons. And if we were to consider the recommendation that protective services who are in the front line and who are not vaccinated receive priority treatment, the question is, what happens to people who are vaccinated and who have decided to take themselves into protection and who end up as the 1 out of 10 in the hospital system? You see, the difficulty in understanding the perspectives and the recommendations put forward is that none of them bear in mind the situation that we are in. Now, I'd like to remind the population that the Prime Minister specifically spoke to the possibility of vaccinations being deployed in the type of policy that he announced, whilst we were dealing with the Delta variant. We have since come into the Omicron variant, and the Prime Minister has provided 1 month's notice so that people in Trinidad and Tobago can be aware of the situation. The government is very alive to the concerns that many people have. I can tell you a story today. One of the lawyers at the Attorney General's office at Ministry of Legal Affairs indicated that she had lost her grandfather. And her grandfather did not pass away from COVID. Her grandfather had heart conditions, and it took the ambulance over 1 hour to arrive to give attendance. The reason for that 1 hour delay is that the entire ambulance service is occupied in moving COVID patients by and large. We have heard from the Tobago House of Assembly that they have run out of mortuary spaces. There is now to be built a 20-foot container to store bodies. We heard the Chief Secretary himself speak to bodies being piled upon bodies. In Trinidad and Tobago, with the Omicron variant, we are currently building out refrigeration space, extra mortuary space in central Trinidad to take the bodies that our regular facilities cannot hold. I can tell you today that I am aware that many countries are now in the zone of considering, as they have done already, mass burial sites and mass cremations for COVID casualties. I just left the San Fernando General Hospital and the pediatrics unit, and every person that I had the privilege of interacting with there expressed deep concern as to fatigue and as to difficulties that all of us are operating under. When we left the meeting with Mr. Roger, I undertook to take instructions. The instructions in relation to the recommendations that Mr. Roger had made, that the government, 1, withdraw its policy, and 2, provide empirical evidence that the vaccines will stop people from getting COVID and stop infections. I returned to the government team, and I can say today that the government is not in a position to withdraw its policy statement. I can say that I now return to the very positions that I have asked Mr. Roger in particular to advance, and that is to literally plead that the trade union movement and the several persons that we met with provide us with recommendations. You see, I want to make it plainly clear. The several trade unions which Mr. Roger spoke for and on behalf of have not given the country, let alone the government, any form of recommendation as to how to treat with the reality of Omicron and COVID Omicron in today's world. I note in particular a very unfortunate editorial in the Express newspaper today indicating that the key to treating with this is to reignite the national tripartite arrangement and, very importantly, to go through the industrial relations route, because that is where collective bargaining and terms and conditions are to be treated with. If I may most respectfully to the editor of the Express newspaper say as follows: the collective bargaining process and the meet and treat arrangements in the industrial court on terms and conditions which are completely different entity by entity does not meet with the reality of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is the Omicron variant. The only way that that can be treated with is by way of a law which stands superior to the collective bargaining process. That law enters into the constitutional balancing of rights. On the one hand, the right to voluntarily enjoy life and to have the privileges of deciding your own medical treatment. That is preserved because the government is not saying to people that you have to take the vaccine. We are saying to those who work in the public sector, For those of you who are in the public sector, the requirement will be that if you want to continue to work in the public sector on normal terms and conditions, that vaccinated people will be accepted in the public sector. Why? Because in the public sector, the government is the largest employer, and therefore, if the public sector is vaccinated, we will be removing many of the persons who go into high dependency unit or who go into the intensive care unit. Will be removing them from the bed space. We are acutely aware as a nation the state and condition of the storage of bodies in mortuaries. There is no more space in Tobago, and Trinidad is, just like Tobago, building out space for bodies as well. We know that the Omicron variant in other countries has resulted in 13 million people in China being put under strict quarantine, in all of Europe engaging in lockdowns and restrictions, in states of emergency, in the United States of America, in different states, etc. We are dealing with a global pandemic that is now on fast forward. And very respectfully to the editors of the Express newspaper, I must insist that the recommendation that is being offered to the people of Trinidad and Tobago who read the editorials, as I do, respecting the freedom of press, assuming that there is advice, I just take the opportunity to indicate why the industrial relations process is not an appropriate process, because it simply cannot factor the immediacy of the time frame that is required. In these circumstances, therefore, it is incumbent upon the trade union movement to say what they want. It is a very difficult position to have no recommendations at all that are specific in nature. No recommendations as to time frame. No recommendations as to what the rollout policy ought to be. No recommendations as to personnel. No recommendations as to transitional arrangements. The recommendation that there is a further education campaign, and the recommendation that we take doctors and nurses to every single person's door, is one that will not respect the fact that Omicron is doubling every 2.5 days. And ladies and gentlemen, as of yesterday, there were 2,662 deaths. And we are now watching 25 to 40 people dying every day. In a 24-hour period, we're receiving up to 40 deaths. We have crossed 2,600 deaths. The government is in the position where we are obliged to act to save lives. We were told on a previous occasion when the Prime Minister spoke in the Delta pandemic and he addressed the nation, the chorus coming from stakeholders was, what is the government's policy? They wanted a government policy statement. Based upon the data and recommendations, the government has stated its policy. Now that we've stated our policy, we are not, as a people, witnessing recommendations, specific recommendations to save lives. What is the alternative from the trade union movement is the critical issue. Permit me to say that I respect each and every one of our trade union leaders because they are advocates for the people and they are discharging the mandates that have been given to them to represent certain interests. As Attorney General tasked with the responsibility to draft the law and to get to the particulars of recommendations, I am pleading on behalf of the government with the trade union movement to provide its alternative recommendations. The Ministry of Health will publicly allow access to all of the international literature and the statistical evidence that we put forward every single day. It's already on the website. The statistical information, the number of deaths, the number of vaccinated, the number of unvaccinated, the number of beds that are left. That is already there, but we are compelled to plead with the trade union movement to give us particulars. What do you want? What do you recommend that can save lives? What do you recommend that can be dealt with immediately? What do you recommend can manage the Omicron explosion? These are very simple questions, and no answers have been given. I would like to say that with the government not withdrawing its policy, and with the deadline of mid-January still upon us, I am completely available every single day going forward to receive recommendations from the trade union movement and any other person. They can be sent to the Office of the Attorney General. The information is already there. Our email addresses are there. We welcome the submissions as to what can be done. I don't respectfully believe that it is in the best interest of the people of Trinidad and Tobago to say, quite simply, as Mr. Roger has, stop. We will not tell you the time frame. We will not give you the particulars of recommendations. And more particularly, I would very much like to ask how this country can satisfy the second condition precedent. The second condition precedent is empirical evidence that vaccines will stop people from contracting COVID and will stop people from spreading COVID, failing which there is to be no adherence to the policy recommended by the government. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the update. That's on the trade union side. On the protective services side, I wish to thank them for the recommendations that they have made. Certainly, we are now, having received these recommendations, at the table, working out some of the dynamics to better treat with the issues of liability in particular. The issue of prioritization cannot be facilitated because everybody who is in the front line will have to be required to receive priority treatment, and therefore the balancing of resources is critical. We simply don't have the medical personnel to run that facility. And therefore there has to be a degree of understanding of the realities of where we are having this discussion, when we are having this discussion, and what we are treating with. May I, at this point, stop and make myself available to answer your questions. Perhaps I can clarify issues that I have not had a chance to address.
Thank you, Attorney General. We'd now like to move into our question and answer segment. Media representatives, you are kindly asked to state your name and your media house before putting questions to the AG. Responses will be given to 2 questions per media house in first instance, and if we have time, we will accommodate additional questions. So we begin with Priya Bihari at AZP News.
Good afternoon, everyone. Priya Bihari, azpnews.com. Season greetings all. AG, is it that after all of this consultation, nothing has really changed in terms of the government policy, and therefore people could interpret this as just a PR stunt, because as you have said, a consultation is not necessarily agreement. So therefore, nothing changes after all these meetings. One. Second question has to do with the vaccination in the public service. Is this what do we call mandatory vaccination for public servants, and therefore it infringes their right to choose whether they would take a vaccine or not, and hence this law requires a special majority in Parliament? Thank you.
What has changed in the government policy as a result of this consultation? And effectively you are asking whether it was a sham. The government's policy, quite simply, its sole and primary purpose is to save lives. The data before us is that 9 out of 10 people in the ICU unit are unvaccinated. The data in the United Kingdom is that 100% of the people in ICU beds are unvaccinated. Our policy in saying that we must save lives, has analyzed whether we go the industrial relations route, take 1,000 collective agreements, I'm exaggerating the number, hundreds of collective agreements or more, sit down one by one, take several months to go through those agreements, and if we have a dispute, go to the industrial court and work it out over the course of the next 2 years. That's option one. That's what I call the express editorial option. The second option is to amend the public health ordinance and create a safe zone amongst employees and employers so that we take those persons out of the jeopardy of finding themselves in an ICU hospital bed as one of the 9 out of 10 people. So the government's policy is still the same. The consultation process is where you have the opportunity to hear what is the alternative. We met with very seasoned practitioners in the industrial relations arena. Mr. Roger is the head of the OWTU. He's at JTAM. He has had decades of experience. All of the leaders present yesterday are no strangers to the industrial relations climate. We have simply asked, what are your alternatives? You know what the government has proposed. What are your alternatives? We have no alternatives. What we have is a statement saying, withdraw and provide us with empirical evidence that I can say quite respectfully just does not exist anywhere on God's earth and will not exist whilst Omicron is raging immediately. So it's not so much respectfully prior what has changed in the government's position. The question is, why can you not volunteer your alternatives? For the protective services, they have volunteered their alternatives. Their alternatives are, effectively, bring every protective service person to a doctor, bring the doctor to them, educate them, counsel them, do medical tests on them, establish their medical condition, allow them to take a vaccine, give them medical insurance, give them liability management, and guarantee them priority in the entire public health system above everybody else. That was clearly and succinctly put forward by the protective services. We are looking at the issue of liability. The medical insurance aspect is a process. Some of those unions are very far ahead in those structures. Forgive me, the protective services also asked to be incentivized to take the vaccine. Whether that is something with further explanation, I will leave it to them to explain that. But what we don't have in Trinidad and Tobago is an explanation from Mr. Roger as the spokesman for these very well respected and very many unions. We have no alternative statement. Your second question is this a rights issue which requires a special majority? I am confident that it is of course a rights issue. It is a constitutional issue. It does not require a special majority because not every Section 4 and Section 5 right of our Constitution need be treated with by way of special majority. That has been made absolutely clear in the courts right up to the Privy Council. So it does not require a special majority, and there are many judgments from around the world and the CARICOM and Commonwealth experience. Up to yesterday, the Supreme Court of Jamaica refused an injunction in relation to Jamaica's mandatory vaccination policy. Ours is not a mandatory vaccination policy because you have a choice to not take the vaccine. There is a consequence on the work side, but nobody can lean you up against the wall, tie you up, and insert a vaccine into your arms. That is not what the government is proposing.
Thank you, AG. We move on now to Joel Brown, TV6 News.
Good afternoon. So in the first instance, in general, the issue of the furlough, was that discussed in terms of how long the furlough period would be for persons who, in the public sector from mid-January, under the new laws you're proposing, that decide they will not take the vaccine? And secondly, In terms of the issue of the public service getting that period off from work, I think it's beginning on the 24th, tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken. Does that allow for remote working for those public servants or for those who would be at home or not?
Those are very excellent points, Jewel. I wish that they had been raised. I pleaded with Mr. Roger to discuss these matters. He stoutly refused to treat with the matters. Mr. Roger's argument was very simple. Number one, I don't trust you. You, Faris Al-Rawi, you, Dr. Keith Rowley, you, Stuart Young, you, Colin Imbert, you, Terence Dial Singh, I don't trust you. Secondly, I don't trust the data. Thirdly, two simple conditions precedent. Withdraw. Second one, provide empirical evidence that the vaccines will stop infections and stop people from getting COVID. I asked Mr. Roger on many occasions to go beyond that into the very nature of things that you're discussing would have come out. Transitional periods, length of furlough, opportunity to be vaccinated, vaccination programs. He would have none of that. My simple question to Mr. Roger is, if you are an advocate of taking a vaccine, because Mr. Roger has very plainly and very commendably said that he has taken the vaccine and he's not opposed to vaccines, then the question is, why is he not supporting other people from taking the vaccine? What is the data that Mr. Roger relied upon in electing to take a vaccine? What is the data that satisfied Mr. Roger as to why he should have a vaccine? Was it to protect himself? Did he take this vaccine in another country where he trusted their data as opposed to the Trinidad and Tobago data that Dr. Parasram brings? Those are questions that Mr. Roger can commendably assist us with. We would again join in repeating the request of the government that the unions provide the alternatives, simply because we don't have the time to take the express editorial route, which is to go and negotiate every single collective agreement. That evaporated with Delta moving to Omicron. And that has been the same situation around the world, because it is not that Trinidad and Tobago is doing this alone. Many countries around the world are in this position. And therefore, we again urge the submissions to be sent.
Right, we move on now to Renuka Singh of Guardian Media Limited.
Hi, good afternoon, all. Renuka Singh at Guardian Media. AG, the union stated that 6 months ago they submitted a document. I know this was obviously before the onset of the Delta and the Omicron. But were there any parts of their suggestions? Could it be useful in how we are going to treat with the vaccination issue? Because that seems to be where we're stalled. And secondly, with this impasse that's happening now, what do you see as the next step? Thank you.
Thank you. The recommendations that came from the Ministry of Labour were very broad and commendable recommendations, which went into what the government actually did. Consistent program of testing, consistent program of education, consistent outreach, consistent counseling, consistent supply of vaccinations, multiple versions of vaccinations, a full campaign. As you can perhaps testify, the government has received close to 2 million vaccines in multiple types of vaccines. And as a member of parliament myself, I have been to door-to-door exercises, as I've said before, in one area that comprises 2,000 plus people. 7 people in San Fernando West in that area came to be vaccinated. Let me repeat that. We took a medical caravan, we took doctors, we took nurses, we went door to door, house to house, asked who needed to see a doctor, hooked up the doctor, hooked up the home, brought the vaccinations in buses to the site, and 7 people took the vaccines. That policy from the Ministry of Labour also recommended in the situation of alpha and beta. That's when we were dealing with the Wuhan virus and the South African virus before we got to Brazilian and then Omicron. In treating with those, it recommended that you could look to the collective bargaining process and you should continue on a voluntary pattern of receiving vaccines. We did exactly that. We went on the voluntary side. We have had people working from home. We have had rotational aspects. Where we are right now is that more and more people in the public service are on quarantine, are on stay out, and the vaccination numbers have hit a wall. We have stopped seeing lines full. So we've taken out of that policy all that we could and we have applied it to the point where everybody in Trinidad and Tobago knows the term comorbidity. Some of us say comorbidity. Comorbidity. Everybody knows the types of vaccines we have. We know the vaccination centers. Dr. Parisram, Dr. Richards, Dr. Hines, Dr. Trotman, they are all household faces and names. So we have used as much of that as we could. In relation to where do we stand going forward, the government, I took my instructions. The government is not in a position to withdraw its policy. I've noted floating around social media a call for rest and reflection by the trade unions. Of course, there is freedom of politics in this country. Let me say why I say politics. It's noteworthy that one of the trade union leaders, Mr. James Lambert, did not attend yesterday, even though everyone else did. But I remind you that Mr. James Lambert is a politician. Mr. James Lambert sat as the vice president of the Senate in a previous government. Mr. Roger is equally a member of a political movement. Mr. Watson Duke is equally a member of a political movement. There is nothing wrong with that. We have freedom of politics in our country, freedom of choice. Our democracy is to be celebrated. But I am reminding you of the context of the messaging. And I'd like us for one moment, please, to simply put aside all of that. This is a time for us to look at what we are dealing with in the situation that it is. The Omicron pandemic. 9 out of 10 people in HCU, HDU, and ICU who are at risk of dying. If they were not on that equipment, they would be dead. 9 out of 10 of them are unvaccinated. The Omicron virus is doubling every 2 days. So I am pleading for a return to common sense. I am pleading to representative leaders laying down their politics. I am pleading for us to return to an understanding that the normal process of collective bargaining and industrial disputes does not apply in the COVID pandemic because of the rate at which it is going and the fact that we have limited resources. And in those circumstances, the way ahead for the government will be to urge the receipt of recommendations at the Office of the Attorney General. As I've indicated, we are open. Our emails are all open. We are working throughout the holiday season. We are please requesting most respectfully and most humbly. We understand representational politics and representational issues. I am literally pleading for the receipt of recommendations because they will be considered and they will be factored in the law that will be taken to the Parliament in January.
We move on now to Navri Hanif of Caribbean Lifestyle Communications.
Good afternoon, everyone. Navari Hanif, Caribbean Lifestyle Communications. Hello?
Good afternoon. We're hearing you.
Good afternoon. Attorney General, referring to the statement when you mentioned that industrial relations policy does not factor in the immediacy of the situation. My question being, if the trade union movement are advocates of the people and the government acts as the nation's largest employer, does that not mean you are dismissing a public opinion that is indicating a distrust in the government?
Well, what I've got to ask you is, what is the public opinion? We know that 600,000 plus people are vaccinated. Do their views matter? We know that public opinion in support of this has been expressed. Do their views matter? So, I mean, this is not a totalitarian state where you have required to get 100% of the support of the country. No, in this democracy and in the first past the post system, the majority aspect is sometimes where you look. And in the first past the post system, that may even include a majority which is a minority, meaning you may have 30%, but somebody has 20 and another has 20 and another, and so you go, and therefore it's not all over 50. So I respectfully ask you to understand that the views that are properly being ventilated right now aren't the end of the equation. What the Prime Minister is required to do is to act. Why should the Prime Minister act? The mortuaries are full. The countries around the world are looking at mass burials and mass cremations. We have a limited number of resources in terms of doctors and nurses and hospital beds and ventilators. We have a ripple effect into the regular healthcare system. I gave you the story of that person in my office at the Ministry of Legal Affairs who lost her grandfather because the ambulance took an hour to get there because the ambulance was diverted to COVID patients. So there is a dramatic effect upon the entire situation. So I respectfully believe that there are multiple views. Certainly there will be very heartfelt polar positions at times, but a government is required to act in the face of the adversity that is afoot.
We move on now to Kijan Haynes from News at 7.
Hi, Kijan Haynes. Mr. AG, the question I have is, you spoke a lot about Mr. Roger and I think the police. One of the names that stood out in terms of unions that were there was tutor. We got an announcement yesterday that schools are going back to in-person from February for the most part. What did tutor have to say about this, if anything? Because a lot of people are wondering why students have to be vaccinated, but not necessarily teachers. That's one. And two, following up on Jules' question, what is the government's plan if you do end up in a situation where essential workers, healthcare workers, your protective services are furloughed? What is the government's plan if we end up in that situation? Thank you.
Please permit me to say that my commentary today in relation to Mr. Roger is not a personal attack on Mr. Roger. Mr. Roger spoke as the representative of all of the unions. No one else spoke. So to answer your question on tutor, Mrs. Antonia De Freitas said absolutely nothing because Mr. Roger did the conversation for all members present. So please understand, I've only called Mr. Roger's name as often as I have because he was the person who spoke on behalf of everyone. What I understand is that every single trade union present, including tutor, agreed because nobody objected. They were all there. Mrs. De Freitas was there. So there was no objection to the two conditions precedent. The two conditions precedent: withdraw and provide me with empirical data, which I now respectfully say could never be provided. There is nowhere on God's earth that empirical data exists, because that is not what it is. The vaccines are not such that you will not get COVID and that you will not spread infections. What the vaccines do is they statistically have demonstrated that unvaccinated people equal 9 out of 10 in a hospital bed about to die, and vaccinated people equal 1. So you have to sort of wonder how we're ever going to meet that second condition precedent. So I'll just leave that there. In relation to your second question, which is if the protective services are furloughed, what is the backup plan? We'll cross that bridge when we get there. In respect of the education system, You had a third question inside of there. It was a subset of the first one. Why do children have to be vaccinated and not teachers? In taking the phased approach, you have to remember the ratios in the schools were such that you'd have one teacher with 30 students. And therefore, we were eliminating the risk by having the students vaccinated. We have now, because of the data that we have, we've taken the step to ask the teachers to be vaccinated as well. So we've completed that bit of the puzzle. So I hope that that answers your several questions.
We have a follow-up question with Jewel.
Yes, good afternoon again, Attorney General. Just as a follow-up to the question I posed earlier, I'm now seeking a direct answer from you in terms of what the government would be proposing in the legislation concerning the length of the furlough. For example, would it be a 3-month period, 6 months, 2 months? What is the government looking at in that regard before any further steps are taken if a public sector worker is not vaccinated under the proposed law? And also, in terms of the Public Service Association, that would be the majority union of those in the public service, which is a large part of the public sector. Would it be prudent to go through with the bill to Parliament without at least getting some input from that particular union?
Thank you. So the Cabinet does not have before it yet the finalized recommendations for furlough. We received in the construct yesterday with the law enforcement agencies certain reflections. Therefore, we are now looking at that issue. Certainly between now and January, that issue will be settled as to, first of all, what is vaccinated? Does it mean that you commence vaccination? Will one shot work? Must you be committed to a regime which will end in conclusion? Secondly, the logistics of ensuring that the medical deferrals and medical exemptions can be managed. Thirdly, the extent of furlough. That would have to be disaggregated entity by entity based upon the nature of services and structures. So we are not in a factual position yet to give you those answers, and certainly I would need the Cabinet's approval for the many recommendations that I have already prepared in that regard. Your second aspect, would you just remind me, you had asked about the furlough and length, and you wanted what else? Jewel?
Sorry, right, you hear me now?
Yes, it was the second aspect.
Right.
I lost track of it. Forgive me.
All right, no problem, sir. Attorney General, in terms of the PSA, given
Yes,
the number
thank you.
of public
Got you.
service workers.
Yes, thank you. Well, the PSA is in an odd position, right? They have a president who is also the deputy chief secretary, and they are being spoken for and on behalf by JTUM, by Mr. Duke, having Mr. Roger speak for the PSA. The PSA, I understand, will come into some degree of change if it does happen sometime towards the end of the year. But right now we have no clear path from the PSA because we just don't know who the PSA is. And certainly the PSA, having been invited, elected to have JTUM speak for it. So I take it that the PSA has put its position because it has not disagreed with what Mr. Roger has said. Their position is based on the same two conditions precedent: withdraw and provide something that is impossible to be provided.
We have a follow-up question now from Renuka Singh.
Yes, thank you very much. AG, if I could divert your attention for a second. With regards to the THA issue, the court matter, Duke has resigned from both boards, and it should have cleared his path to now become part of the THA executive. What is the status of that court matter now?
Well, I don't share the conclusion that you have premised your question upon. Mr. Duke is still the president. I understand that at some point in the future, his presidency is supposed to end, right? So Mr. Duke is the president of the PSA. Secondly, in relation to that matter, the matter is a question of law. Now, this is a question that's going to come up over and over again. When are you deemed to be required to relieve yourself of your other opportunities? So there is merit in having the law settled. Remember, the construction summons is not intended to unseat anybody's position. It is simply asking the court to take a position of clarifying the law. I'd like to remind you of something. In the Commissioner of Police order, as Attorney General, I met a construction claim, which was a genuinely good construction claim. Mr. Ram Logan, in bringing forward the claim on behalf of his client, asked the court to interpret the law, not to strike out the government's order of 2021, but to interpret the law. Coming out of that, the entire country is now in a clearer position that the Constitution always set out that you had to have the nominees, whether acting or substantive, approved by the Parliament. Even though the entire country relied upon a process that it had used over 200 times, that's the 2009 order, over 200 acting appointments were done without parliamentary approval. Mr. Ram Logan, as Attorney General, in his capacity, used that 2009 order. Mrs. Prasad Bisesa, I, as Attorney General, Dr. Rowley, because that is what the law was interpreted to be capable of supporting. When that issue was brought forward, and I looked at it in the context that Mr. Ram Logan had framed it, you will note that Madam Justice Kangaloo said, quite remarkably, the Attorney General agreed with the claimant. In other words then, my written submissions were that I agreed with the claimant. Where we are right now is we have Mr. Duke saying, well, at some point I may resign. He had an offer to resign. There's an offer which is to be accepted. The offer is at some future date right now. But nothing stops this situation from arising in the future. And therefore, there is merit in quite simply letting the court conclude its process so that the law is settled for all time go forward. It was open to Mr. Duke to immediately resign and agree to the position, as I did in relation to a claim that Mr. Ram Logan brought. When I looked at it carefully, I said I must agree, and I agreed. So this law needs to be settled so that we don't find ourselves in choppy waters in the future.
Follow-up question from Para Bihari.
Yes, thank you again. AG, I just want to follow up on Kijan's question. Can you just clarify if it is when school opens in January, only teachers who are vaccinated are allowed to go to school, or is it after the law is passed?
It's only
Can you clarify that?
It is only after the law is passed that teachers would be in that position. So we are in the position where a law can only be prospective unless it is specifically declared to be retroactive. We are not asking for retroactivity, obviously, in the law that we propose to take in January. So the requirement for vaccinations for teachers under the law that we are proposing will be a prospective one, meaning it is go forward, and the requirement for vaccinations will be on a go forward basis.
And our last question will come from Kijan Haynes.
Hi, okay. A follow-up to my first question. You said that in terms of essential workers, we'll cross that bridge when we reach it. Respectfully, it seems as though we have reached there. We are at this impasse, and pretty soon we may have furloughed healthcare workers. There has to be something in your brain that's a plan B, a plan C. Is even short-term employment an option, considering there are many unemployed university grads right now itching to get into the public service?
I can tell you that I am down to plan Z, A, B, A, C, A, D, A, E. My obligation is to prepare multiple arrangements even though they're never used. Why I say that we need to get there is that I really don't want to be premature in excluding by way of attitude. Let's start off with attitude. I don't want to exclude the receipt of submissions. Secondly, what we do know in this country is that there are many qualified people and that there are many people who are in search of jobs. Some of these things can be testified by the service commissions. How many people are aware of how long it takes to receive a position under a service commission, be it the teaching service commission, the other commissions, judicial and legal services, etc. So I would respectfully believe that Trinidadians and Tobagonians are sensible people. Yes, we like to assert ourselves. Yes, we have a free and fair democracy in this country. Yes, we may not agree upon approaches at times, but I have a deep sense of faith in the people of Trinidad and Tobago that we have the ability to do the right thing. To be clear, I am respectfully pleading with the representatives of the trade union movement to simply advance their suggestions, their recommendations. Right now, what we know is that they don't like what has been said, but there is no alternative whatsoever that has been advanced. And your questions today have gone into the exact areas that we need to speak. Furlough, length of furlough, qualifications, vaccination regimes, who will administer medical certificates, who will administer deferral certificates. None of those things have been addressed. And I'm respectfully requesting of the very honorable members of the trade union movement that they provide particulars, knowing that I am ready, willing, and able to address these positions. Allow me one last clarification. I heard one of the reporters indicate that the protective services, and then they focused upon the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. I'd like to please be clear. The fire services, the prison services, and the police services, the representation that we got from them was a unanimous one. It is not to single any of them out. The discussion was very cordial. Some very useful recommendations were put forward, and I thank those representatives, Mr. Seron Richards, Mr. Leo Ramkisoon, and Inspector Gideon Dixon. I thank them sincerely for going to particulars because they were very useful. So, ladies and gentlemen, permit me to draw a conclusion to this. This is such an important issue that you have allowed me to disturb your preparations for Christmas. I'd just like to wish everybody in Trinidad and Tobago a very holy and peaceful Christmas. We are in a time of reflection. We're in a time of preparation. The Prime Minister, by announcing the policy that he has centered upon ensuring that livelihoods can continue by making sure that businesses continue to stay open. And one of the biggest businesses is the public sector. People need to be able to feed their families by ensuring that we are not in perpetual lockdowns. In this regard, I urge our beautiful citizens of this country, all people that live here, to please prepare your families in the best way possible. I urge you to vaccinate. I urge you to obey the health protocols, and I urge you to maintain a steadfast hope for Trinidad and Tobago, because with that hope, we can certainly achieve prosperity. God bless you all. Merry Christmas to Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, AG, and thank you for joining us at today's media conference. Please remember to wear your mask, wash your hands, and watch your distance. Have a safe and Merry Christmas.
This is TTT. Live for local.